Hey guys, welcome back. This is my second build guide. This is going to be for an Oghmir foot fighter. He's also got mounted archery in there, and I'm going to be talking about his primary attributes. Then I'm going to be covering his recommended action skills and professions. And then lastly, I'll be putting together a tier list talking about all the different aspects of the game and how this build shapes up in them. If you haven't seen this video before, a little bit about me. I've got about 3,000 hours in the game since launch. I've played every single build in the game. I've theory crafted weird builds like Thursar Mounted Mage and tested everything in the game. I know the game like the back of my hand. I'm going to be providing opinions today. Some people will disagree with me. That's very common and moral. I'm sure there'll be arguments in the comments about how certain things are that I say are wrong or whatever, and that's totally fine. But I'm going to provide the best knowledge that I can for you guys so that you can make an informed decision on what character you want to play. And I'll be going through this. The video might be a little bit long, so feel free to scroll through if you're looking for a specific thing. Maybe you want to see the end of the tier list. You can just go ahead and check that out. But basic Oghmir, you're going to be Blaine, age 30. I don't have him at max height for a reason. If you have him just below max height, you can max out strength, dex, and con. So I have him in that. I have him just a little bit taller than max height, but he only loses, I think, 1% max melee damage bonus. So his melee damage bonus is 23%. He has over 200 health. He's a pretty beefy frontline footy. He hits really hard. I believe that Oghmir foot fighters are the meta. I think they are the best foot fighter in the game. They can do so much. It's insane. And I'll be talking about that as I go through their tier list. And we can just go ahead and jump into professions here. Basic footy build we got here. We got anatomy, archery, armor training, axes. I'll talk about axes. I like to use one-handed axe and shield is my favorite to run. And I'll talk about how to get consistent with that. But a lot of people don't know if you right swing and overhead swing with a one-handed axe, the animation is extremely similar. So as a short little fat meatball with a big tower shield, you can offset your body to the right a little bit and do those swings, and it is incredibly hard to read even for a veteran. So if you trade well and you put them on the back foot, you can punish and make them take a 50-50 gamble every time they parry you. And that's just a practice thing. It's really, really good. Poleaxes is also extremely good, but I would recommend finding somebody in game that can practice with you and teach you the animation hides for a poleaxe. A poleaxe is a little bit too advanced for this build guide, but I have a buddy named Dirty in my guild that if you reach out to him, I'm sure he'd be happy to coach you on how to use a poleaxe. I've seen him consistently go 1v3 against people just because they can't read it. It's super hard. So poleaxe is another alternative that's really, really good here. Blocking, we got combat maneuvering, controlled riding at 100, defensive. This is all pretty standard stuff. Ecumenical at 20. I think every build in the game should have ecumenical at 20. And even though it has very low intelligence and psych, you have just enough mana for one cleanse. And because your psych is so low on this character, one of the biggest counters to you is magic, right? You get hit really hard by magic spells. You don't really resist very much. So having one cleanse for a foam for either you or your horse can make the difference between living and dying pretty consistently. If you do use your cleanse and the fight is over, make sure you take your armor off and sit down. Otherwise, you'll never get the mana back. Your mana regen will be so bad. So 20 points in ecumenical, I feel, is just a standard. Needs to be on every footy build in the game. Endurance at 100, that's good. That's something you can pull from if you want to put points into something else, test something, right? Endurance is one of the things you can pull from first. But the one downside of Oghmir foot fighters is they do struggle with endurance. They're typically using a big weapon, either a hammer or an axe. I know a lot of people prefer the two-handed swords. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the mid game and the late fight, you're often going to be out of mana if you're not playing, if you're not conscious about it, right? That's something that can really mess up an Oghmir. You never want to be at the point where you can't pull out your longbow and rip off like at least 2 arrows, because oftentimes people will try to run from you because you're slow, right? That's one downside of the build. Heavy armor at 100. I like this just because the new tower shields are so heavy. You want to be able to put on steel. You want to be able to put on ogmium. You need this all the way up there because ogmium is super heavy. That's the best armor in the game. You're not going to be wearing it very often, right? But tower shields are heavy, and you will be using those very often if you play like me. So having heavy armor at 100 is nice. Mounted archery at 100 is just awesome as well. Potion utilization, these are just extra points I had. One thing that this build does better than anything in the game is it has more self-heal burst healing than anything on that you can play. It's extremely good at just surviving, which is so important. I'll talk about that more when I get to the tier list. Before I talk about professions, you got your Clade order for Haven. I don't recommend leaving until you're level 13. Level 13, your build is largely online. Then you're working towards things like beer belly, so you can drink bigger potions. Drink more of a potion and get more health from it. But at level 13, you have everything that you will be using just by default. I recommend also while you're in Haven, do not pick up these last two Clades until you are out of Haven. Get some heavy armor, put it on, level up your heavy armor training to a point where you know you won't need it anymore, or you're at the point where you can get these Clades while it's easy, basically, and then pick up those Clades. Just pocket the action points. Don't use them until you get out and do your heavy armor training. Then for professions, the main things here is weapon crafting and shield crafting, right? You're a mounted archer, so you want a good bow, right? Bows are super fucking cheap. A lot of people make them. They're really inexpensive to craft. You also have the highest strength in the game, right? Get a raw strength ring, it gets even more nuts. But right now, you have the highest base strength max in the game. So that means you can go to the auction house, unless it's a stam drain bow. You got to be careful. You don't buy one of those. You can buy any bow on the market for typically 2 gold or less, and then just slap with it. So that's super cheap. Same thing with horse armor. Horse armor and pet armor, while important to a mounted archer, is super cheap on the auction house. So I never pick up those professions. It's just, you don't need them, right? So easy to get that stuff. Weapon crafting is very important. Shield crafting is very important for 2 reasons. Both of those are individual reasons, but if you have one-handed axes, that's not a popular weapon, right? You're not going to be able to easily find that on the market for a reasonable price. So being able to craft your own one-handed axes is huge. Being able to use two-handed axes isn't so bad. Oftentimes it's available on the market. Downside is it's a two-handed axe, and it's way easy to read. I really like playing two-handed axe in bigger team fights or doing PvE content because it just slaps super hard. And what you want to do is you want to play for parries. If you have a two-handed axe, you shouldn't really be swinging too often unless people are just ignoring you, which sometimes happens on an Oghmir. You should play for parries and then do quick attacks. If you are getting ignored on an Oghmir, that's like the best case scenario. Oftentimes, good players will just straight up ignore Oghmirs because it is so painfully hard to kill them that the strategy is kill everybody else first. So if you enjoy being the last one alive in fights, right? This is a good build for that. Then I have shield crafting, just because crafting your own personal shield is a pain in the ass. So being able to go out, get iron wood, get whatever wood you care about, so that you can craft your own shield at the right size for your character is important. It's just like in my previous video, my mage has to be an armor crafter because he needs a custom tailored suit for his mana regeneration. It's the same concept. You need a custom shield. You want to be able to use stuff that is good for you, and you don't want to be relying on other people for that stuff. You can go just buy the resources if you want, but as long as you can craft the weapon and you can craft the shield, you're good. You should be good to rock and roll. Okay. Now I'm going to go over the tier list. So I'll talk about this build. I'm just going to give you guys a heads up. I think this is one of the best builds in the game. So this is going to be pretty stacked, right? Starting off with PvP, this is an S tier build. It is fantastic. Some tips for PvP. It takes a lot of people a long time to realize speed is still king in this game. And the downside of this character is it is slow. So what you need to quickly realize is if you're playing an Oghmir, you get somebody low, they're going to instinctively run away from you. So unless you're fighting other melee in a big team brawl, you should instinctively just pull your bow out and kill them. Lots of bad players will chase and burn all their stamina and then realize, oh, I should have brought my bow out, and then pull it out and not have enough stamina to finish the kill. But Oghmir Foot Fighter is what I consider the best frontline PvP build in the game. It's so good from an action economy standpoint. You have like I said, the best burst healing in the game. You can crack pipe yourself. You can do your stand ground thing. You have your war cry. You can pop a health pot that completely refills your health. Literally get a new health bar in under 2 seconds. You can bandage. There's just you can eat blood kua to get your reserves back on the run, right? There's so much you can do to just be a live lord. If you watch my video where the 2v7 we did against Odin Seed, my buddy Dirty, the guy I mentioned earlier, at one point he's just nonchalant in the video. I'm on 3 of them, implying that he is assaulting 3 guys by himself, and it's just I'm on the other side of the dungeon fighting other people. I don't heal him at all, and you can see his perspective for part of the fight. He's just being a live lord. He's getting ganged by 3 people, and he's just not dying. Right? There is tons of video out there of people just attacking towns and fighting 1v or small versus large, right? 5v20. And a lot of times it's a bunch of Oghmirs just keeping themselves up from an action economy standpoint. Oftentimes you'll have Alvarans that hurt the team more than they help. They'll dive, they'll get hit really hard, they'll run back, stand in front of their mage. The mage will bomb heal them. The mage will now be out of position. It'll eat up all that action economy. Meanwhile, you have an Oghmir just brawling on the front line, can peel for the mages as long as he doesn't overextend, and takes less damage, does more damage. It's just overall better. It's easier to play. It's better, right? I think it's an S tier build. If you want to support your guild, you want to support your team, you want to be a team player, you want to bring just an animal to the fight, Oghmir Footfighter is all the way so good. PvE, I'm going to put this in A tier, mostly because he's a mounted archer. So mounted archery is broken good for PvE. Unless you're in a dungeon, you can solo almost anything. You can't solo a forest troll because it throws rocks at your horse, but you can solo the other 2 types of trolls. Takes a long time, right? I'm not putting it in S tier because there is a better PvE build out there. It's a mage tamer where you can go do anything solo, basically, including trolls, all trolls. It does trolls faster, which is another topic for another video, but just because there's a better build out there, I'm not going to put it in S tier. PvE, though, you can go out and do serious work. You can also, one thing that it does do really well, since you're an Oghmir, you can put on Ogmium, which is the best armor in the game. You can be the main tank for the raid that you're going to go do. You can tank bosses pretty easily. 1v1. Again, this goes into A tier because S tier would be a Thursar. Right, Thursar. The only thing Thursars do super well, they do the best, is the 1v1. Oghmir Footfighter, though, is a very close second. You can trade better than anyone. This ability here, this passive right here, I think it's called Stone Skin. I think it's probably, in my opinion, it's top 3 best clades in the game. A passive resistance or damage mitigation of it reduces damage by 3 to all piercing and all slashing damage, just passively. That is so good. You watch videos of people fighting in big fights on an Oghmir, and you just look at the combat log, and it's like hit for 1, hit for 0, hit for 1, hit for 1, hit for 3, hit for 0, right? It's so good, right? And that means that makes them better for dueling too. So 1v1s you can trade with people pretty well, right? So it's a pretty good dueling build. 1vx though, this is where it starts to fail. If we're talking a no shit 1vx, you are by yourself out there in the world and you get jumped by even 2 people. What's going to happen is you're going to fight them, you'll get one of them low, and just instinctively, not even a good player needs to know this, this is just instinctual, a player will run away from you when they get low. You can pull out your bow and maybe get a cheeky kill while the other guy's wailing on you, but it's going to be very hard. So now you have to turn your attention to the guy who wasn't low. And unless you're a monster and you can burn 2 people super fast, which does happen, right? Now you're going to be fighting another guy. First guy's going to be healing up. You get the second guy low. First guy comes back, and they just repeat the process. It is very hard to 1vx with this build. Can you do it? Totally, right? Is it easy? No, not even close. Utility, though. When I think utility, I think of things like healing. I think of like killing horses and stuff like that. It's a mounted archer. It's going to absolutely shred horses. It just will demount people faster than anything in the game. It's got the best self-healing in the game. You've got Blood Kua, you've got massive potions, resetting your health bar, you've got crack pipes, you've got stand ground, you can plug doorways, stand in a doorway and just be a parry live lord while your guys heal you. The utility is pretty off the chain with an Oghmir if you know what you're doing. I will say it's pretty high skill cap, right? And I'll talk about that when I get to the skill cap. But for solo play, again, solo play kind of struggles for the same reasons I talked about. If you bump into a group, it's going to be rough. You know what? Because it's a mounted archer, you can do a lot of stuff with it. So I'll bump it up to D tier. If you're fighting 1v1s and you're doing, I'm just thinking, playing it by myself wouldn't be the worst experience in the world, but it's definitely not going to be the best experience in the world playing it solo. It's more of a team fight, team oriented thing. Crafting, I'm going to put it in D tier. And the reason is, if you want to run the best of the best shit, right? You want to run Ogmium, weapons and armor, or you even want to run steel, like you want to take full advantage of your build. The stuff to do that is very time consuming. To go get that stuff is very expensive, requires almost all of your primaries to be able to do that type of stuff. So it's just time consuming, right? They're about average, slightly, I'm marking them slightly below average just because to be fully online is very time consuming. I guess you could say that about anything, but it's just pretty bad with Oghmir because they're the only class that can wear Ogmium without a trinket. That's why it's called Ogmium. Because it's for Oghmirs, right? And that's the most expensive material in the game, right? So that's one downside of crafting. Wealth generation, I'll put that. It's between A and B, right? It's kind of like right here. Mostly because they're a mounted archer. They can do everything out in the world that is not in a dungeon, right? So it's just generally pretty good, and that bugs me. So I'm just gonna put it in B. Farming, same thing. Same thing. I could probably delete one of those. Uptime. Let's see. Uptime. So when I'm talking about uptime, I'm talking about how often you're getting value from your primary points. So uptime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in B tier. And the reason is you're a mounted archer. So 200 of your primaries is dedicated to being on a horse. If your horse dies, right, or you dismount to finish on the end game, which is pretty common, it's really hard to finish a footy with a mounted horse. You dismount, all of a sudden those 200 primaries are now a dead stat. But everything else is still good, and the build itself doesn't really need anything else. Oftentimes one of the first things I do drop is mounted archer. It's a footy build though. It's not expensive to run a footy build. You can fit basically everything you want, right? So the uptime there is pretty good. Skill cap. I'll give this an A. I won't give it an S. Oghmir Foot Fighter is hands down the most noob friendly foot fighter, just because you take so much less damage. You can just take a beating. Where the skill, why it's not S tier, is the skill comes from knowing when to do what. It comes from knowing when to crack pipe, when to use your clades, when you should be having a bow out. All of that stuff is learned, but it's learned pretty fast. The other downside of it is if you have multiple accounts, like most people, and you're logging into your Oghmir, it is very easy to forget that you can crack pipe, right? You can, it's pretty common that the fight is over and you're like, wow, I could have drank my pot. I could have crack piped, right? So that's a downside there. Team fights, they're S tier. Hands down, if somebody is asking me, well, which character should I bring? And they have the option of bringing an Oghmir Foot Fighter, my answer will always be bring the Og. Just, it's so good for a team fight for all the reasons I've already talked about. Just raw action economy. It just, your team can do more. If your goal is to punch up, if your goal is to 5v10, that type of stuff, you need Oghmirs. You can't just have an army of fast Alvarans. It would never work. Fights would be so drawn out, people would just get bored and leave. Defense, they're S tier. They can wear the best armor in the game. They have the best defensive passives in the game. They have the best self-healing in the game, at least in a burst window. They're not a healer, but they have the best defensive burst window in the game. just hands down S tier. Amazing. Offense, I'm going to put that in A tier. They hit super hard. They slap, right? Thursars can hit harder. Humans can hit harder. Humans can barely hit harder. But these guys still slap, right? If you need to go do PvE, you bring a steel axe, two-handed steel axe, you're gonna hit. You can two-shot bandits, right? They hit super hard. Longbow, you can use the best longbows in the game. They hit super hard. Not the best, but they're damn near close. Overall, I'd give this build an S. This is what I consider the pinnacle of being a foot fighter. It's not super common. Most people don't gravitate towards the short little meatball guy that's all hairy and looks like a monkey. But if you are not playing solo, if you're playing with a group, even if it's a group of 2 or 3, this is hands down best build for a footy. I think, personally. Until things change, it is very good. There are downsides. Your speed is rough, right? People will run away from you. You'll get frustrated. You might not have the stamina to get your arrow out. It's pretty stamina intensive, so a good mage might atrophy you to counter you, right? That's where the cleanse comes in. Cleansing and atrophy is totally worth it because it'll fuck your end game. It'll fuck your mid fight pretty hard. So, oops. Hopefully that didn't mess up my little recording. But other than that, guys, that's the build. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. If you have any comments, same thing. Thanks, guys.